And when we have chronic inflammation, we begin to destroy tissue, just like as if you let your outdoor patio furniture rust every day and get worse and worse. But many times, this disease process can be noted way in advance before it begins to totally destroy an organ or a tissue by monitoring something called HSCRP. So remember, it's this interplay of your immune system, inflammation, oxidative stress, and how it just slows everything down. So here's the good news. Inflammation is reversible, which means preventing chronic disease is possible. Welcome to the Trusted Pharmacist, where you'll learn the truth about how the body works. Hello, it's Steve Hoffart, the Trusted Pharmacist, and welcome back to this week's episode. Of all the things that I see in the pharmacy on a regular basis, inflammation is the number one thing we talk about all the time when it comes to living your healthiest and preventing disease. And when we talk about inflammation, we're not talking about a skin rash. We're not talking about a broken leg where things swell and get red. We're talking about chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation is truly the driver of disease. And the way that I see it is, there's a marker that we can actually test called HSCRP, which is an inflammation marker produced by the liver that's actually the fortune teller for current disease or disease to come. And if you ignore this, you're really ignoring your ability to affect your health in the future. So if you want to make change, you need to be monitoring this HSCRP. But more importantly, it's one thing to know if it's high or if it's out of balance. But what's more important is, what's the causers, what's the driver, and how do you fix it? So we're going to take a deep dive into what HSCRP is, how it works, what it does, what are some of the other markers that are additive that tell you that if you don't address these things now, you're going to end up with things like cancer, diabetes, cognitive decline, arthritis, all the diseases nowadays that people fear and are scared of, you actually can be proactive and prevent if you look at an HSCRP. So what I want to tell you today is, hang with me. This will get a little deep at sometimes, but if you can follow me along, you're going to understand how inflammation is something that you can control and set you up for better health. So before we can talk about C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation, we have to understand what inflammation is. Inflammation is actually a protective effect of the body to help to heal us when we break a bone, to help us protect ourselves if we get exposed to bacteria and viruses that cause things like flu. But these are supposed to be acute inflammation. So what happens is, if you break a bone or you happen to have a virus that gets in your system, your body triggers inflammation. And there's a unique interplay of a couple things. This inflammation first is important to make sure that we get good blood flow to the area that needs healing. So what happens is we get a lot of vasodilation, we get a lot of nutrients, and a lot of what are called reactive species or parts of our immune system that go there to attack and fight infection. If you've got a broken bone, a lot of these inflammatory markers go there to start clearing away bad stuff and building back good stuff. The other thing that happens is, through this process of cleaning things up with our immune system, we create something called reactive oxygen species. And these type of reactive oxygen species create a lot of oxidative stress. And the best way that I can explain that is, during oxidative stress, it's like the body begins to rust. Good things are happening. It is clearing up and healing processes. But the problem is we create a lot of byproducts. It's the equivalent as if you put your nice piece of furniture outside in the sun, and it gets rain on it every day, and it gets oxygen on every day, and it begins to rust. Well, as you well know, this rust can be a problem at times, and it can begin to damage and mess up your furniture. The problem is if this inflammation process, which should be acute or temporary, doesn't stop, it becomes chronic. It's like we're chronically rusting. We're chronically producing inflammatory mediators. We're chronically turning on our inflammation and our immune system. And this rust begins to accumulate. And when we have chronic inflammation, we begin to destroy tissue, just like as if you let your outdoor patio furniture rust every day and get worse and worse. It would begin to damage things, and it wouldn't be what it used to be. Well, the same thing happens to your cells and to your tissues and to your organs. And at one point, if we begin to get enough oxidative stress and inflammation and damage to these tissues with an overactive immune system and these reactive oxygen species, they will begin to break down. So keep in mind, chronic disease does not happen overnight. Chronic disease happens over time. But many times, this disease process can be noted way in advance before it begins to totally destroy an organ or a tissue by monitoring something called HSCRP. And that is a high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And this is an inflammation marker that the body produces in the liver that begins to say, hey, we've got some inflammation going on here. Sadly, most medical providers don't even check this marker. So unless you ask, they're probably not going to check it. But you should always have one of these done as like a yearly check to see where your inflammation is. But even more so, if your levels are high, it needs to be repeated on a daily basis to figure out, one, are we attacking the problem? And two, what's the driver? Because if we're not, and we ignore this, we're going to have problems down the road. So when you run what's called a CRP or an HSCRP, we need to ideally keep it below 1. Below 1 indicates there's not a lot of inflammation or problems going on. But more importantly, if we get in a range of like 1 to 3, this is an indication of low-grade inflammation. We've got something kind of boiling, cooking, stewing, something going on to say, hey, especially if all along you've been less than 1, less than 1, less than 1, now all of a sudden you're like a 1 to 3, this indicates something is happening that we need to look at. More importantly, if you get 3 and higher or up to like a 10 on this HSCRP, you've got full-grade, full-blown inflammation. Now, don't get me wrong. You could have recently had an infection, and that can trigger your HSCRP to spike rather dramatically. But when that infection is gone, that number should go down. It's this long-term, day-by-day inflammation of HSCRP. If we don't get it under control, it's going to drive things like fatigue and tiredness, brain cognitive issues, and begins to destroy the gut. It makes the immune system go haywire, which can increase your risk of autoimmune and other immune conditions. It also has an effect on causing arthritis, aches and pains, poor sleep, poor mood. So what's really neat is HSCRP can actually be a predictor of things to come. And if we look at it, it's a good thing. What I've seen, though, is if your HSCRP is high and you've got other markers in your blood, it's kind of like 1 + 1 = 3. And sometimes these feed each other to make things worse. For instance, if you've got something called a high homocysteine, which is a marker of methylation and also a marker of oxidative stress. If your homocysteine is 8 or higher, which once again, keep in mind, the upper ends of what's normal is definitely higher than 8, and your HSCRP is high, this is a really good indication that you could really have a high risk of cardiovascular disease down the road. Same thing if your HSCRP is high and you've got high triglycerides, you've got a high what's called Lp(a), which is a genetic marker of cholesterol issues, or you've got something called apoprotein B, which is an indication you've got some metabolic issues driving inflammation. These all go together to set you up for greater risk of heart attack and stroke. Also, too, sometimes you can check something called a ferritin, which is your storage form of iron. And a lot of times, if your HSCRP is high, and then we also check our ferritin levels, and we see that's high, that can be an indication of an infection going on, and that may be something you don't realize. It could be something like Lyme's disease, or something like a flare-up of like an Epstein-Barr, or like a herpes simplex. And that could indicate that your body is trying to protect that iron from the bacteria or the viruses from getting it. And that HSCRP tells the immune system's trying to fight this. But without doing these blood markers, these things can lay dormant and just cause inflammation and drive problems and drive further disease. And the last marker that you can check along with the high HSCRP is something called uric acid. Uric acid itself can drive this inflammation process and cause a lot of oxidative stress. That's more of this free radical production. That's in terms of this extra rusting and further drive inflammation. It's this continuous loop. Uric acid actually is a breakdown product of purines, and it was once thought it was all about eating meat. But what we've learned over the years is that uric acid levels can actually go up dramatically if we have a lot of metabolic inflammation. That's eating a poor diet. That's a lot of high sugars, a lot of insulin that gets produced to bring down those sugars. That drives inflammation. It can drive up your uric acid levels. And that further perpetuates this issue of inflammation, this oxidative stress, this rusting. And the one thing that all of this goes back and affects is something called your mitochondria, which is the part that helps produce your energy. And if you have a lot of inflammation, you have a lot of oxidative stress, and you don't do things to take in terms of exercising and doing dietary things or taking a lot of antioxidants to calm this inflammation, this further makes our mitochondria go in a dysfunctional way down, produce less energy, and drive all of these things from fatigue to tiredness and drive further disease. So if you look at all of these markers in combination of an HSCRP and they're all moving in the wrong direction, then we've got to look at what is the cause of what's driving all this. So you've checked your HSCRP and it's in that greater than 1 range, or it's even higher. Let's say it's 8, 9, or 10. Once again, this is the fortune teller to tell you you need to do something now and figure out what the cause is. But sadly, most practitioners, when they see HSCRP, will just say, oh, well, I don't really know what to do with it. But let's take a deeper dive and look at what the typical causes are. One, and probably the biggest thing that I see, is gut inflammation. Your gut inflammation drives inflammation throughout the body. And if we don't take care of our gastrointestinal tract, and if you've got things like bloating or food sensitivities or gas or GI issues, this can be an indication your gut is inflamed. Well, what can make your gut inflamed? Probably the most common thing that I see is something called dysbiosis. This is a mix of bad bacteria in the terms of we got a lot of inflammatory bacteria that create a lot of inflammation problems. Keep in mind, your immune system is just right below your gastrointestinal lining, and they have a direct interplay because, believe it or not, your immune system is what protects your body from the outside world. And if you've got a bad number of bad bacteria in the gut, or you don't have enough good bacteria in the gut, that inflammation and those bad bacteria trigger an inflammatory response, which further drives inflammation, drives some of the stress that puts the body through, and triggers the immune system to be hyperstimulated. And this hyperstimulation of the immune system is what then can further drive inflammation and makes things more probable. And this imbalance of bad bacteria in relationship to good bacteria tickles and triggers that immune system to chronically create a lot of inflammation, produce a lot of inflammation factors, which further drive disease and makes the problems worse. The second big thing that I see, unfortunately, all the time right now are people with poor blood sugar control. That starts even as low as being something like insulin resistant, up to pre-diabetes, and even diabetes. Because unfortunately, when you have elevated blood sugar spikes, this creates elevated insulin spikes. And unfortunately, inflammation makes you store fat. And when you store fat, this fat becomes an inflammation factory. You can take a look at people who have high visceral fat, and that's this fat in the abdominal area that sets around your organs, and it produces a lot of inflammatory prostaglandins, things called interleukins, all of these inflammatory mediators that just further tick off your immune system, make it mad, and produce inflammation. And when we take and we hyperstimulate that immune system by producing inflammation, it will further drive disease. So it's important to keep those blood sugars under control. And if you know you're metabolically inflamed or you're packing on a lot of abdominal fat, this can be a huge driver in terms of inflammation. The next big thing is something that is an explosive epidemic, not only in our country, but across the world, and that is toxins. We are flooded with chemicals, these forever chemicals that are in everything we do, whether it be the plastic containers that you're eating and drinking out of, your cosmeceuticals, skin lotion, skin products, some of the dyes that are actually used for tests that are in our radioactive materials that we use to do MRIs and CAT scans and things like that. The other thing is too, there's a lot of chemicals out there that are what are called phytoestrogens. There's a lot of things that are called phytonutrients that mimic some of the hormones that our body makes. And these set and compete with the hormone receptors of our natural hormones. And then at that point, the receptors don't know how to react. It creates an irregular response, and that can further drive inflammation. So these toxins that are out there set us up for failure, even in terms of something like mold. You may not think of mold as a toxin, but the materials that are in mold trigger this immune response. Remember, it's this interplay of your immune system, inflammation, oxidative stress, and how it just slows everything down. It ultimately affects the mitochondria, which is in every cell, that drives and decreases energy, which makes everything slows down and just drives these disease processes. The next thing is chronic stress and poor sleep. And unfortunately, we live in a fast-paced world. Many of us are trying to do 10 things at one time. And unfortunately, it is that aspect of handling the stress of everyday life. Being pulled in a million directions, our body creates a lot of what's called cortisol. Cortisol is really unique. It actually can be a decreasing inflammation chemical, but over time, if it's produced day after day, you get a sympathetic response. And this long-term stress application to the body, day after day, will begin to do one big thing that I see a lot, and that it destroys the stomach lining. It punches holes in the gut. And when you punch holes in the gut, the bacteria that are in your stomach are able to leak and cause something called leaky gut. Things should not leave your gastrointestinal tract like the bits and pieces of these bacteria. And your immune system says, wait, we don't want these here. And it triggers an immune response just as if you're being affected by like a flu vaccine. It's a low-grade inflammation, but it's like this low-grade inflammation that's a little fire burning in the background. But you start piling on all these other things, and all of a sudden what's a little fire now becomes a blaze, triggering inflammation. And a lot of times it can rear its ugly head in terms of cancers, diabetes, cognitive decline, skin rashes, arthritis. And so this leaky gut needs to be taken care of. And that's one of the ways that you see that stress drives further inflammation. And that's the important part of sleep, because sleep actually drives up your cortisol levels. It runs up your blood sugars. And we've already talked about how blood sugars cause problems. So it's this vicious cycle of day after day running into issues with regard to stress and blood sugars that further make inflammation worse. And lastly, I'm a pharmacist, so I have to talk about drug nutrient depletions. Many of the drugs that you take on a regular basis can actually deplete vitamins and minerals that make inflammation worse, or depletes vitamins and minerals that help protect you against inflammation. One of the biggest offenders are statins. These are medications used for cholesterol. These deplete things like vitamin D and coenzyme Q10. Vitamin D is one of the most important things you can do to help reduce inflammation, because low vitamin D levels are directly tied to inflammation. Coenzyme Q10 is an essential part of your mitochondria to produce energy. And we talked about when you have chronic inflammation, you create a lot of what's called reactive oxygen species, a lot of rusting, and that further makes your mitochondria not produce as much energy and drives further problems. Well, guess what? Statins deplete CoQ10, which are essential to make sure that your mitochondria work properly. They also can deplete certain minerals, and that also makes the problem worse. Another common drug for blood sugar issues is metformin. Metformin depletes your B12 levels. It can also deplete things like CoQ10. And unfortunately, when you have low B12, this drives up your homocysteine levels. We've already talked about high homocysteine and high hsCRP further drives cardiovascular disease. Proton pump inhibitors, these are things like omeprazole, pantoprazole. These are things used for GERD reflux. These deplete all of your minerals, lower your B12. Once again, B12 can affect homocysteine levels, and all of your minerals are important in terms of cofactors for enzymes to keep inflammation in check. Birth control pills, if you're on those, these synthetic hormones deplete your B vitamins, which can lower neurotransmitters and also lower other actions or steps that increase inflammatory pathways. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, these are over the counter and taken by millions of people every day. Anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen, naproxen, aspirin, these actually take and can cause leaky gut. We've already talked about how cortisol can punch holes in the gut. Well, NSAIDs only make that problem worse, which chronically turns on a low-grade inflammation. And I find it a little oxymoronic because, believe it or not, NSAIDs are taken to reduce inflammation, but it's more short-term acute inflammation like with aches and pains and fever. But believe it or not, long-term NSAID use can actually drive long-term inflammation, which can further cause problems with disease. And then lastly, fluid pills or diuretics that are taken for blood pressure control or fluid retention. These deplete all your minerals, which further drive processes that can increase the inflammatory issues that you're dealing with. So here's the good news. Inflammation is reversible, which means preventing chronic disease is possible. But we have to take an individualized approach and put back things that reduce inflammation and support the body while it's under inflammation to help it repair itself over time. One of the first things you can do is take something called curcumin. Curcumin is a natural anti-inflammatory that's a powerful substance in terms of reducing some of this inflammation. It also protects something called glutathione. Glutathione is our master antioxidant. Remember how we talked about during inflammation, our body produces a lot of reactive oxygen species, which further can cause more of that rusting of the body's inside, drive further mitochondrial issues, and reduce a lot of energy issues or your energy production. Well, the neat thing is that curcumin can actually preserve your glutathione levels, which is the master antioxidant. Taking a good curcumin is super important because unfortunately curcumin doesn't get absorbed very well. So we're looking at taking a curcumin product that's got something called a phytosome match with it to help improve its absorption, or things, sometimes they actually have something, the curcumin products mixed with black pepper, which helps improve the absorption. The next thing is a good, high quality, ultra pure omega-3. This is a gold standard, a non-negotiable for me, not only for just a daily supplement, but especially if you have inflammation in terms of reducing your inflammation and helping prevent things like cardiovascular disease, which a lot of inflammation can drive. Keep in mind, cardiovascular disease is the number one killer of men and women in our country. And if you can reduce inflammation, you can dramatically reduce your risk. But you must take enough of a high quality ultra pure omega-3, at least 2,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA. And if your levels of your HSCRP are even higher, you may need to take up to 4,000 milligrams of an omega-3. Keep in mind, if you go above 4,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA a day, we need to be careful because it does have blood thinning effects. So we want to be careful with that. The next big thing is magnesium. I think I've seen up to 60 to 70% of people are low in magnesium due to medications, lifestyle, and just poor diet. Magnesium is a wonderful anti-inflammatory. It actually can help reduce stress. It's been shown to directly reduce inflammation if your magnesium levels are low. And my favorite is magnesium glycinate, starting out with about 200 to 500 milligrams of magnesium a day and adjusting from there. The next thing is we've talked a lot about how a poor or an unhealthy gut drives inflammation. So doing something like a probiotic, but not just any probiotic, certain targeted probiotics to reduce gut inflammation. So we talked about the leaky gut aspect where your gut falls apart and allows inflammation, allows the bacteria in your gut to get through, which drive like a low-grade inflammation long-term. So something like a probiotic with Akkermansia is great because it's been shown if mixed with things like sodium butyrate, which you can get through your diet, or taking a supplement, can actually repair that gut lining. So if it's got holes in it, it can put it back together and take care of it. The other thing is certain probiotics that are super high potency. One of my favorites is something called Visbiome. Visbiome is a ultra high potency, highly studied probiotic that's been shown to have certain strains that reduce gut inflammation and problems like that. If you're having IBS, Crohn's disease, gastrointestinal bloating, Visbiome is a great probiotic to help reduce that inflammation. Where most probiotics have like 20 billion or 50 billion CFU, Visbiome in one capsule has like 112 billion CFU. And a lot of times we'll have patients short term take it multiple times a day to get gut inflammation down. We're seeing a lot of people right now with mast cell activation and a lot of issues where we've got a chronically heightened immune system that's triggering a lot of histamine. And these mast cells release all of these chemical mediators which stimulate the immune system and drive inflammation. Something like quercetin can be very helpful in terms of stabilizing these mast cells and driving down inflammation. And then lastly, a couple last supplements you can do is one, if you're low in vitamin D, that's like a no-brainer. You need to be replacing your vitamin D3 because D3 is directly related to inflammation. Low D3 levels drive inflammation. You need to be shooting for a blood level of your vitamin D, which the marker is a 25 hydroxy vitamin D of between 60 and 80. If you're below that, yes, the lab's going to show normal at like 30, but it's not optimal. 60 and 80 is critical. And then the last thing we talked about is during periods of inflammation, your body is creating massive amounts of these reactive oxygen species, which causes the rusting of your tissues, which further drive disease. So two things you can do is you can either replace directly your master antioxidant called glutathione, which helps to scavenge up a lot of these free radicals and carry them out and get them out the door. Glutathione's powerful. You need to take a glutathione supplement that's something called liposomal to help it get absorbed, because if not, it doesn't work well. Or you can take the precursor to glutathione, something called N-acetylcysteine. And N-acetylcysteine is great as a conversion factor that can ultimately get converted to glutathione if you've got good health and good genetics. One of the things that I recommend, and it's a good antioxidant too, if you do take N-acetylcysteine, you probably should be taking vitamin C with it to decrease your risk of kidney stones. So these are just some things that I think you can do. There's no magic bullet. There's not a one size fits all. But if you mix these supplements with good diet, good lifestyle, making sure you're getting adequate sleep, reducing stress, work on cleaning up your gut, I think you will see you can drive that HSCRP marker that may be elevated down to normal levels and set yourself up for better health. So if you've had unexplained fatigue and tiredness, skin rashes that you just don't know where they came from, aches and pains, can't get out of the bed in the morning, when you're trying to think, it's like trying to push your thoughts through Jell-O. You can't function and you can't get through the day. I encourage you to have your doctor run an HSCRP. And if it's high, don't panic. We've talked about today the things that are the big drivers that you can personally attack and do yourself to fix. We've talked about the supplements that you can take. And it really takes looking at yourself on an individualized, personalized approach to go after these markers and these things that are driving inflammation. And I hope you found today's podcast useful. And if so, please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so that you never miss an issue. And even more importantly, if you found today's episode helpful, share it with a friend or a colleague, or leave a quick review, because this is the way that we're able to tell this message to more people, because our ultimate goal is to make sure people can take control of their health and prevent disease. I hope you found this episode on inflammation helpful, and you can start your journey to better health. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, I'm Steve Hoffart, the trusted pharmacist, and those that want the truth about their body, follow us.